if you pick up the pace and you go for the momentum, then you will earn those moments. It's kind of like that idea that I think I've talked about before. Treating the text like you're singing a song by Billie Holiday or Frank Sinatra versus turning the text into opera. That if you're treating the text like it's opera, then every single thing that you say has this kind of drama to it. It's like you're pushing too hard to make it feel dramatic and impactful and emotional. And subsequently, it actually has the opposite effect on the audience. But when you if you think about the way Frank Sinatra or Billie Holiday sang, it was very conversational. Do you know what I mean? They would, it was almost like they were having a conversation through song with you, and every now and then they would hit a high note or build to a crescendo. But if you're trying to turn every line of dialogue into a climax, then the climax ain't going to have much impact. So what that also speaks to is not breaking up your line. Like, follow the punctuation. Just as a general guide, at least at the beginning, when you're looking at your text, the writer is telling you when to take a pause with a full stop. The writer will tell you when to take a breath with a comma, or at least a half breath. But what I often see, and I could see it in this film, was that the actors were breaking up their lines of dialogue. They were breaking it up. So again, in order to really overemphasize the point that they were trying to make. And as a result, it not only was I as an audience member going, okay, I've seen it. I've seen that moment. Let's get on with it. But what they were saying actually didn't have the same kind of impact as it would have had they just said the line. And just let it be conversational. Let it just come out. It's that whole idea that Donald Woodburn talks about again, like the lowest common denominator, that we all understand English. You don't need to try to overemphasize what you're saying in order to be understood. We get you. And so there's by taking the pressure off of yourself and your need to try to help the audience understand what you're saying, the audience will understand because they're not idiots. The audience collectively are smarter than we are. And we want to treat them as such. Does that make sense? They don't need to be spoon-fed. They don't need to be told what is important or what is dramatic. So pick up your cues. Pick them up. I think the other effect of going for the momentum in a scene is that it doesn't give you time to overthink how the line should be delivered. Does that make sense? That your thinking time as an actor is in your prep. We think before we act so that we can act before we think. And once you're up there, you want to let yourself be impulsive. And a way to trust your impulses is to not overthink them. Something that Scott Williams said when he was here last year was that the moment that you begin to overthink an impulse, it's no longer an impulse. That impulse becomes an actor trying to make some kind of a choice in the moment. Does that make sense? It's them. In fact, it's not even a choice. It's an idea. That's exactly right. It becomes the actor turning their impulse into an idea of how the scene should go. They would have been better off just trusting the impulse and acting on it. Does that make sense? So again, if you go for the momentum of the scene, if you go for the momentum and don't turn every moment into a moment, then you'll begin to trust your impulses more. Sometimes what I see in self-tapes, or again in this short film today, was that like all of the choices that the actors were making were all great. They were all perfectly good choices, but it was just taking way too long to get to them. And if they took out all of that dead air, the scene would have absolutely sung. It absolutely would have worked so well. And it would have also made the characters seem cleverer, smarter than the way the actor was portraying them, because the more time they were taking, in a sense, they were trying to spoon feed the audience, which also made it feel like the actors or the characters, it felt like the characters weren't as smart as they needed to be. It's a weird effect. When we talk about comedy, you'll also find that, again, the difference sometimes between the piece just turning into like outright drama and it becoming comedy is pace. And that faster is funnier. And just take out all that dead air. When can you take a moment? One way to think about when to take a moment is when your character is in their emotional truth. That when we are in our emotional truth, that's when we tend to slow down. Because, in fact, the longer we take in those moments, the more we get into the realm of emotion and feeling. Where you don't want to be putting in pauses left, right, and center is when your character is talking about exposition. What do I mean by exposition? What is exposition? Backstory. Exposition is any information that the audience needs to know in order to understand what the story is about. And if your character is talking about exposition, that's not particularly interesting to the audience. We just need to know it in order to understand the story. But you want to, this is a kind of a general rule. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but get through that stuff. Get through it pretty quick, so that you can earn the pauses when your characters are in their emotional truth. The other time that you can afford to take a moment is when you're landing what you're saying, or you want what the other person has just said to you to land. So what is the little insight that I know I've shared with you guys before about how to make a moment land? Pause. How long?
2 seconds?
2 to 3. 2.5 to 3. That scientists did a study where they figured out how long a person needs in order to experience the moment. And what their conclusion was, because again, how do you figure that out? Like, is it just a second that we need to experience the moment? Is it 5 seconds? Is it a minute? And what they discovered, the minimum amount of time that people needed in order to experience the moment was between 2.5 to 3 seconds. And that 2.5 to 3 seconds is enough for us to really let a moment land. And since I learnt that, I cannot tell you the difference that it makes in actors' work when it feels like now they're actually not taking enough time, that they're kind of speeding through something. That if they just take that 2.5 to 3 seconds, any longer than that, we start to get into the world of emotion and feeling. Does that make sense? Because emotion takes time. I think that's a really great way to think about what is being said that you need to ensure lands with your scene partner. And maybe don't move on for that 2.5 to 3 seconds to make sure it landed. That's not a lot of time, but it is more time than sometimes I think actors will give themselves when they are landing something. I know I'm kind of saying two things right now that seem to be in opposition to each other. One is actors love moments, audiences love momentum. And if every if every moment is a moment, then nothing is a moment. Conversely, when it is important to land a moment, you can afford to take that at least 2.5 to 3 seconds to make sure it lands. That is the minimum amount of time that this study demonstrated that people need in order to experience something as a moment. You can feel it as I do it now, right? If I take 2.5 to 3 seconds. Does that make sense? The more emotional something is, the more time you can take. That you can, when it is warranted, you absolutely can just let yourself be and feel. And the audience loves watching a character feel. But as I said, if you're doing that all the time, you have to earn it. You have to earn your moments. If you don't earn those moments, as I said, then nothing will be a moment, because you've just turned everything into a moment. And then the work feels self-indulgent and it's just taking too long to get through. Does that make sense?